Pay attention, because what I'm about to tell you could transform the way you interpret every interaction you've ever had with someone from a different generation than your own. And perhaps this is already happening in your life right now. Someone has developed feelings for you, but the generational gap between you complicates everything you thought you understood about attraction and emotional bonding. I am a psychologist, and I ask you to stay because this goes far beyond romance. We are talking about psychology, dynamics, power, and emotional fragility. Before we move on, like this video and subscribe to the channel, because what you are going to learn here could save you from making a decision you can't come back from later. Now imagine that someone much older or much younger than you starts focusing on you with unusual intensity, as if they discovered something in you that the rest of the world hasn't been able to see. And then your mind does something extremely dangerous. It begins to fill in the empty spaces with its own interpretations. It tells itself this cannot be a coincidence. This must be special. This is destiny. But psychology offers us a completely different reading on attraction between people of different ages. It doesn't always have to do with genuine love. Often it responds to mechanisms of projection, unresolved curiosity, and emotional needs that haven't found another channel. And this is where most people lose the thread. They confuse intensity with compatibility and attention with real commitment. And if you have ever felt attracted to someone considerably older or younger than you, you are not alone in that. But there is a deeper truth within that dynamic that almost no one manages to perceive. What seems like an authentic connection can actually be an emotional incompatibility perfectly disguised. When an older person bonds with a younger one, a psychological transference frequently occurs. One seeks vitality, novelty, or validation. The other might be seeking guidance, stability, or simply sustained attention. This imbalance creates an intense emotional charge that feels exactly like love, but which in many cases is chemistry born of difference, not a true underlying affinity. You may find yourself thinking about that person constantly, replaying entire conversations in your head and attributing layers of meaning to messages that perhaps had none. But your brain doesn't always work to tell you the truth. It works to make sense of emotional stimulation and whatever it finds new. And when an age difference comes into play, power dynamics operate silently, shaping your emotions without you even noticing. So, before attributing all of this to fate or dismissing it as something wrong, you need to understand what your emotions are actually responding to. There is something almost no one teaches you about emotional attraction between people of different generations. When an older person falls in love with someone younger, or vice versa, your brain doesn't just react to that person, it reacts to what that person represents to you. Psychologists call this projection, and it is one of the most powerful distortions that exists within human relationships. When you are young, you may project onto an older person attributes like security, wisdom, and stability, as if that person already had figured out what you still don't know how to handle, You feel insecure in your own world, and that person seems serene, settled, and emotionally complete, but what you perceive doesn't always match reality. Sometimes it is simply your need for guidance reflected outward. And when you are the older person, the projection can take a completely different form. The other's youth, their energy, their admiration, the feeling of being needed, or even the rediscovery of something emotionally alive. You may feel that this person sees you in a way that life had stopped doing. But here is the truth that many find uncomfortable. Projection feels like chemistry precisely because it generates intensity without any real substance. The mind fills emotional voids with fantasy, and that fantasy becomes emotionally addictive. You start to anticipate their messages, to overinterpret their silence, to give weight to small gestures that in reality never should have carried it. It is at that point where attachment begins to form, not from true understanding, but from emotional anticipation. The more uncertain the dynamic, the stronger that attraction becomes. That is why relationships with age gaps can become so consuming. They simultaneously activate curiosity and insecurity. Your nervous system becomes hypersensitive. Every interaction seems amplified, and the brain begins to release dopamine unpredictably, creating a cycle that resembles emotional dependency. But what you are actually looking for is not necessarily that person. It is the feeling of being chosen by someone who is perceived as different from everything you have known. And that difference is confused with depth when often it is simply unknown emotional territory, and the unknown does not always equate to something healthy or true. When you manage to slow down enough to observe your feelings without the interference of fantasy, you begin to distinguish whether this connection is built on mutual understanding, emotional maturity, and a shared direction, or if there is simply an emotional contrast that feels powerful, but perhaps lacks the solidity necessary to be sustained long-term. And that distinction brings you clarity instead of confusion, and above all, it returns self-knowledge to you. There is a moment in every age gap relationship when the emotion stops being something you are living and becomes something happening to you without you having consciously chosen it. This change is subtle, but enormously significant, because it is the instant where emotional imbalance begins to reorganize your perception without you realizing it. When someone significantly older or younger enters your emotional world, they don't just bring their personality, they bring their entire life history, their accumulated expectations, and their unconscious patterns. And your mind begins to adjust to that presence in ways that feel like fascination, but are often just adaptation. We humans naturally calibrate ourselves in the face of perceived authority or what we find novel. If the other person seems more experienced, your brain may yield ground without you noticing. If they seem younger or more emotionally open, your brain may adopt a more protective or involved role, and none of these responses are neutral. They change the way you interpret everything, from the tone of a message to the meaning of a silence or the way you receive affection. One of the most ignored psychological forces in these types of dynamics is the perception of power. Not necessarily real power, but perceived emotional or social power. You may start to feel that the other person knows something you don't, or that they are emotionally ahead or behind you, creating an imbalance that can feel like attraction because it activates your need to reach or protect them. This is where emotional responsibility begins to blur. Instead of two people relating from an equivalent place, you begin to occupy roles like mentor, follower, savior, or apprentice without having consciously accepted them. And once those roles are installed, feelings intensify because roles create structure, and structure is perceived as meaning. But meaning is not always the truth. Another layer of this dynamic involves the activation of your attachment style. If you have an anxious attachment, you likely find yourself more worried, more emotionally sensitive, and more vulnerable to fluctuations in the attention you receive. If your style tends toward avoidance, you may experience a cycle of closeness and distance where proximity feels exciting, but also overwhelming. The age gap amplifies these patterns because it introduces uncertainty about your emotional position within the relationship, and uncertainty fuels attachment, even when that attachment is not healthy. What looks like a deep emotional bond may actually be your nervous system trying to stabilize within a dynamic it doesn't fully understand yet. The danger doesn't lie in the age gap itself, but in the unexamined roles and emotional expectations that form within it, silently shaping how you love, how you react, and how you slowly lose your emotional balance. At some point in these relationships, a threshold usually appears. Emotional intensity becomes normalized to such a degree that you stop questioning it. And it is precisely then that it exerts the greatest influence over your decisions. Because familiarity is not the same thing as safety. Just because something seems emotionally constant doesn't mean it is stable. In age gap attraction, the emotional rhythm tends to become irregular, and the mind starts adapting to that unpredictability by calling it passion. But unpredictability is one of the primary drivers of emotional fixation. The human brain is programmed to pay more attention to what it cannot anticipate. So, when someone gives you attention intermittently, sometimes with deep intensity, other times with noticeable distance, your nervous system starts to prioritize them in your emotional hierarchy without your conscious authorization, and you begin building narratives around that inconsistency. You tell yourself that the person is complex, misunderstood, or has exceptional depth, but psychology shows that inconsistency creates more attachment than consistency. And this is where emotional confusion starts to feel like emotional depth. You are no longer responding only to the person. You are responding to the pattern that person creates in your nervous system. And that pattern becomes addictive because it keeps your attention activated even in the other person's absence. Another important aspect is what we could call the illusion of emotional acceleration. In age gap relationships, things tend to move faster than in others. Emotions are revealed quickly. Conversations become deep. Almost immediately, signs of attachment intensify, and a sense of premature intimacy is experienced, but speed does not imply depth. Sometimes speed only reflects that two people are projecting meanings onto each other much faster than they are building real understanding. True emotional connection is not measured solely by the intensity it generates. It is measured by clarity, coherence, and mutual emotional responsibility. But when there is an age gap, these foundations can be inadvertently overlooked because both people feel that something significant is happening and rush to name it before they have fully understood it. What is experienced as a deep connection may actually be an accelerated emotional bond, lacking solid foundations. And over time, that lack of foundation begins to manifest as confusion, overthinking, and cycles of emotional dependency where you find yourself trying to stabilize something that was never truly stable. And it is right at that moment that awareness becomes crucial. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you can no longer ignore it. And finally, you begin to distinguish emotional intensity from emotional truth. There is something most people misunderstand about attraction between different generations, and it is this. The most intense feelings are not always born of similarity, sometimes they are born of contrast. And contrast is emotionally magnetic because it challenges our internal expectations of how a connection should feel. When someone significantly older or younger enters our emotional space, they disrupt our habitual relationship patterns, and our mind interprets that disruption as something important. But disruption does not equal compatibility. In fact, the brain frequently confuses emotional disturbance with emotional relevance because that disturbance triggers greater attention and more intense memory encoding. That is why we remember those conversations more sharply, those moments with greater intensity, and those emotional peaks more clearly than in a balanced relationship. But what we remember is not necessarily emotional truth, it is neurological activation. And this is where people begin to build entire narratives about someone based on the intensity of what they feel rather than on the consistency with which they are treated. Another aspect that deserves attention is the emotional asymmetry inherent in these dynamics. One person usually feels they are discovering something new, while the other feels they are recovering something they had lost. This creates an unequal emotional exchange, even when both are genuinely involved. When one person feels they are being introduced to an unknown emotional world and the other feels they are being reminded of something they left behind, the relationship begins to revolve around different psychological needs without either of them noticing. You may feel that this person understands you like no one else does, but sometimes what they understand is not you, but the version of you that fits the internal narrative they have about how a connection should feel. And that distinction is subtle but crucial because feeling understood is perceived exactly the same as feeling loved, even when that understanding is incomplete or partial. Over time, this generates emotional dependency, not necessarily through manipulation, but through cycles of reinforcement. Your brain begins to associate that person with emotional awakening, with validation, or with the expansion of your identity. And that association is reinforced every time emotional intensity is followed by relief or reconnection. But healthy emotional bonds are not built on cycles of intensity, they are built on stability, mutual clarity, and sustained emotional presence. When these elements are missing, the nervous system begins to compensate by increasing emotional investment to fill the void. That compensation feels like deeper love, but in reality, it is the brain trying to resolve uncertainty through attachment, and the more you try to understand it, the more emotionally involved you become. Unless you learn to step back and evaluate what is truly being exchanged beyond what is felt in the moment. Now I want you to consider something that many people avoid thinking about because it eliminates the fantasy and brings responsibility back to the center of the equation. In age gap attraction, there is always a question of synchrony, not only emotional but also regarding life stages. And this is where many relationships suffer in silence. Even when feelings are genuine, two people can care deeply for each other and still be completely misaligned in terms of direction, stability, priorities, or stage of emotional development. When one person is building their identity, career, or emotional autonomy, and the other is going through a completely different life phase, the relationship begins to carry an invisible pressure that no amount of chemistry can fully resolve. Your mind may resist this idea because it feels like you are asking it to question something it values. But questioning is not rejecting, it is clarity. And clarity is what protects you from long-term emotional confusion. Over time, what usually happens in these dynamics is that both people start adapting to sustain the connection without realizing the cost that implies. You may start minimizing certain needs of your own, amplifying others, or ignoring discomfort because the emotional euphoria seems to compensate for everything, but adapting is not the same as being aligned. Sometimes you are not growing together, you are simply accommodating one another. And that difference matters later on because adaptation requires constant effort, while genuine alignment feels natural. Another psychological layer present in these relationships is projection toward the future. When emotions are intense, people tend to imagine how the relationship could be instead of observing how it is in the present. The age gap intensifies this dynamic because the difference itself invites the imagination. You begin to build future scenarios, conversations that haven't happened yet, significant moments, and shared life paths. But those visions are supported by emotional potential, not by current reality. And potential is one of the most persuasive illusions that exist in the emotional realm of relationships because it creates the feeling that you are already halfway to something, even though no real steps have actually been taken. And the more you invest emotionally in that potential, the harder it becomes to objectively evaluate current compatibility. You might find yourself rationalizing inconsistencies or minimizing legitimate concerns because your mind is protecting the imagined future it has already clung to. But true emotional maturity requires separating what is felt from what is consistently demonstrated over time, not in moments of high intensity, but in patterns of behavior and sustained emotional responsibility. And when you begin to observe patterns instead of possibilities, you gain access to something very valuable: the ability to discern whether this connection is building something solid or if it is simply going through emotional highs and lows that feel significant but might not translate into something real and sustainable. I want you to hear this clearly, without emotion distorting it, because this is where awareness can either set you free or keep you stuck. Attraction toward people from a different generation is not automatically wrong nor automatically valid. What matters is not the age gap itself, but the emotional structure that supports it. Whether both people are relating from a place of equitable emotional responsibility, genuine respect, and clarity, or if one of the two is carrying a disproportionate emotional burden without realizing it. When feelings are intense, your mind will always try to justify the connection, will build narratives, highlight the best moments, and erase the confusing ones, because that is how attachment works. It protects the bond even when that bond is not stable, but you are not your attachment response. You are the one who can observe it. And when you learn to observe instead of react, you begin to regain control over the influence that any person exerts over your emotional state. One of the most important questions you can ask yourself in any intense relationship is not how do I feel, but how do I feel consistently over time? Do I feel safe or on permanent alert? Do I feel emotionally stable or constantly off balance? Is there clarity within me or does confusion prevail? Because clarity is rarely chaotic and confusion is rarely accidental. It generally signals a lack of synchronization in timing, in expectations, or in actual emotional availability. And if someone genuinely fits into your life in a healthy way, you won't spend time trying to decipher their every move. You will feel understood without the need to overanalyze everything. Now, if you find yourself in a situation like this, I'm not telling you to walk away or to stay. I'm telling you to slow down the emotional pace enough to see clearly what is happening beyond the intensity. Because intensity can feel like meaning, but true meaning is built through consistency, not emotional peaks. And if this connection is real, it will survive your clarity. It won't ask you to ignore your instincts, your needs, or your emotional stability in order to keep existing. And if it does, then what you feel isn't love in its most genuine form. It's an emotional entanglement, shaped by differences, timing, and psychological projection. And you deserve to know the difference between the two because once you do, you will never mistake chaos for connection again. MV note-taking.